Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 21, The Reckoning with Serbia. We have seen how Falkenhayn had first of all been drawn to the east in 1915 by the vital need of opening through communications between Turkey and the Central Empires and thus relieving the Dardanelles, and how he had been forced to postpone this indispensable operation by the grievous state of the Austrian army on the Russian front. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, while welcoming the transference of effort to the east, urged the view that Russia should be made an end of once for all, by the use of even larger forces and even wider movements. Falkenhayn did not agree. As soon as the Russians had been signally defeated and were in full retreat in Poland and Galicia, he returned with eagerness to his original plan. This involved the immediate total destruction of Serbia, and for this purpose the bringing in of Bulgaria upon the side of the Central Powers. During the whole of July, after various earlier efforts, negotiations were conducted at Sofia with King Ferdinand and his ministers. The Bulgarian government, always pro-German in their sentiments, were profoundly impressed with the disasters which had overtaken Russia and the vast recoil of all her armies. But the struggle upon the Gallipoli Peninsula dominated their actions. They knew that another great effort to storm the peninsula and open the way to the fleet was imminent. Until this new battle had been fought, they would not take the plunge. If the Turks in Gallipoli were beaten and the British fleet arrived before Constantinople, an attack on Turkey offered them even far greater prizes than could be wrung from Serbia. Moreover, the elimination of Turkey from the European theatre, the opening of the Bulgarian southern frontier to the advance of an allied army, and the opening of the Black Sea to the British fleet would almost certainly win Romania and Greece to the Allies' cause, and thus expose Bulgaria to the gravest peril if she was found alone in the Balkans on the wrong side. Therefore, Bulgaria, unmoved by the German victories in the east, awaited the issue of the battle in the south. On August 6, a general attack by all the British, Australian and French forces began upon the Turkish positions, and simultaneously a large new British army descended upon the peninsula at Suvla Bay. The landing of 25,000 men was effected without serious opposition at a point where only a few Turkish gendarmes were watching the coast. The only Turkish troops available were 3 days' march distant at Buler. However, owing to the incompetence of the British general commanding the landed forces and an unbelievable series of accidents and blunders, the troops remained upon the beaches and did not attack the high ground in earnest until powerful Turkish forces had actually arrived. The battle was then joined at all points and reached its climax on August 9, when the further advance of the Suvla army was arrested by the Turks, and when the British and Gurkha troops, who had actually gained the key position of the Sarıyer mountain, were blown off the summit by the fire of their own naval artillery. By the 15th, the British had been defeated all along the line with a loss of 20,000 men, and Bulgaria decided to join the Central Powers. On September 6, a convention was signed at Ples by Falkenhayn, Conrad, and General Ganchev, representative of Bulgaria, by which Germany and Austria-Hungary, with 6 divisions each, were to be on the Serbian frontier ready for operations within 30 days, and Bulgaria, with at least 4 divisions, within 35 days. As the Bulgarian divisions were double the ordinary infantry strength, these arrangements concentrated against Serbia, from 3 separate quarters, the equivalent of at least 20 divisions. The failure of the Austrian offensive in Volhynia made it necessary for 4 Austrian divisions to be replaced with a like number of Germans. Thus, no less than 10 German divisions were to be employed. The Serbian troops, says Falkenhayn, that were still fit for battle were estimated to number in all 190,000 to 200,000 men. Our troops available against them were some 330,000, who in the main must have been superior in military value to the Serbians. The latter could hardly be expected to withstand the effects of massed heavy artillery or of trench mortar batteries. Such was the storm soon to break upon the violent, small, unhappy country. The menacing attitude of Bulgaria riveted Serbian attention, and her military preparations were soon obvious. Great efforts were made by England and France to persuade Serbia to make concessions in Macedonia to Bulgaria, which would avert the impending danger. But the Serbians, with equal obstinacy and courage, rejected these overtures and prepared themselves to meet the onslaught of their hated and deeply injured Balkan neighbor. Serbia began to mass her troops against a Bulgarian invasion from the east, and was altogether unaware of the terrible German thrust which was preparing from the north. Not only had Falkenhayn to find his 10 divisions against Serbia from the Austrian front, but he had also to meet the main offensive of France and England, now rapidly approaching in the west. For both these needs he had to withdraw 4 divisions from the Russian front, including Hindenburg's command. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had been authorized to begin their long-desired offensive through Kovno towards Vilna, and by the first week of September this was in full progress. Animated by Ludendorff, Hindenburg bitterly and fiercely resisted these withdrawals of his troops. Dominated by his local point of view, he fought for every division. His correspondence with Falkenhayn reveals the intensity of the struggle of these two powerful figures. On August 27, the 1st German Division had been taken from the Mackensen Group and ordered to Orsova on the Danube, partly to bring it into the new theater and partly to expedite Bulgarian decisions. At this time Conrad seems to have been drawn into the Hindenburg and Ludendorff orbit. He supported the Hindenburg requests for the strengthening of the Kovno-Vilna offensive. Falkenhayn gave a clear answer. A reinforcement of the Kovno group is certainly to be desired, but it is incomparably more important that the Dardanelles should be secured and, in addition, the iron in Bulgaria struck while it is hot. Consequently, the forces which we are able to withdraw from the region of Brest-Litovsk without slackening our hold on the enemy's throat must go to the Danube. During the later days of August and the early part of September, no less than 10 divisions were removed from the central and southern sectors of the Eastern Front and sent either to the Danube or to meet the oncoming attack in France. These withdrawals were but the preliminary. Before very long, says Falkenhayn, the necessity was bound to arise for 10 or 12 divisions to be taken from the region of the army group in the north for use in other theaters of war. These transferences and the threatened minimizing of the Eastern theater were viewed with stern hostility by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. For them, at the moment, the Vilna offensive was the only object in the world. Or their strategic convictions, or the fruits of their preparations, or their chance of winning distinction were equally at stake. And here was Falkenhayn and OHL not content with coming over to the east, winning tremendous victories, and thereafter weakening the southern armies, but now actually withdrawing from Hindenburg and Ludendorff the very divisions they were counting on for their promising operation in the north. Repeated warnings were given by Falkenhayn that whatever happened to the Vilna offensive, he meant to have all the troops he wanted to attack Serbia and meet the French. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were bluntly told that they must adapt their plans to this condition. They were to give up 2 divisions in the middle of September, and other forces would constantly be withdrawn from their command after a few days' interval. Hindenburg and Ludendorff replied by counter-demands. They declared themselves in full battle, hopefully advancing on their left and heavily attacked on their right. They claimed in extreme urgency the 10th Corps withdrawn from Mackensen, which was assembling at Bialystok for transport to the west. Let them have these for Kovno, even for a fortnight. Falkenhayn refused. The 10th Corps went to France. On September 19, Falkenhayn informed Hindenburg that the removal of portions of the 12th and 8th Armies must begin, and that a division of the 12th Army in reserve, the 26th, must go at once. 6 more divisions were to follow with all speed. Hindenburg and Ludendorff complained about an interference in their rights. They required these divisions for the capture of Riga, a main feature in their plans. This issue was fought upon the removal of the 26th Division. The division, said Falkenhayn, is required for the Serbian front. Not one more day can be allowed. Even when the 26th Division had been wrenched away, Hindenburg and Ludendorff continued their resistance. They would, they said, in a token of independence, release the troops as soon as possible. But when they could release them, they could not say. They were being heavily attacked themselves. The whole of their plans would miscarry if they were weakened at a moment when great results hung in the balance. I expect, wrote Hindenburg, that I shall succeed in preventing the enemy from breaking through. It is impossible, however, at the moment to send off any more troops. This can only be done when the attack has been beaten off and after the front has been shortened by the taking of Smorgony and the bridgehead of Dvinsk. Falkenhayn replied brutally that the Wilna offensive was of no consequence. What did it matter whether the line on which Hindenburg and Ludendorff settled for the winter was drawn through Smorgony or further back? He had to face the great French and British offensive in France and to nourish the all-important attack upon Serbia. The demand that Your Excellency should transfer the first of these 2 divisions to the west as soon as it is possible to entrain them from Wilna must therefore be adhered to. Hindenburg refused point-blank. He sent a letter to the Supreme Command challenging the entire past conduct of the campaign by Falkenhayn. The fact that further relinquishment of divisions is now meeting with difficulties is due to the plan of campaign favored in the summer, which was unable to strike a deadly blow at the Russians in spite of the favorable circumstances and my urgent entreaties. I am not blind to the difficulties of the general military situation which have ensued, and if the Russian attacks are beaten off really decisively, I shall relinquish further divisions as soon as it seems possible for me to do so. But I cannot bind myself to a definite time. A premature relinquishment would give rise to a crisis, such as is now being experienced, to my regret, on the Western Front, and in certain circumstances it would mean a catastrophe for the army group, as any retiring movement of my troops, which are but weak in comparison with the enemy, must lead to very great harm being done to the formations, owing to the unfavorable condition of the terrain. I request that my views should be represented to His Majesty. Falkenhayn replied with vigor. Much as I regret that Your Excellency should without any cause consider the present moment suited for explanations of events in the past, which are therefore unimportant at the moment, I should not trouble to refute your statements, if they concerned only me personally. But as it amounts to a criticism of orders issued by OHL, which, as is well known, have in all important cases met with the previous consent of His Majesty, I am unhappily compelled to do so. Whether Your Excellency agrees with the views of OHL does not matter, once a decision has been made by His Majesty. In this case, every portion of our forces has to adopt itself unconditionally to OHL. He then proceeded to make a highly controversial and at the same time masterly rejoinder to all the criticisms and insinuations which Hindenburg and Ludendorff had put forward. He reflected acidly upon Hindenburg's operations, in the sense that he had been ready to put up with them so long as they did not obstruct larger possibilities. He concluded, "I will report to His Majesty the scruples which Your Excellency raises against the withdrawal of the 2 divisions. I must refuse to bring the remaining points of your telegram to the knowledge of the Emperor, because they only concern past events, about which I do not intend in any case to approach the Supreme Warlord in these grave days." The clash was front to front, but the Emperor supported Falkenhayn, and Hindenburg bowed. It was well for his fame that he did so. He was taking a local view and a partisan interest. Had he and Ludendorff sat at the summit, they would have viewed a different scene. He suggests this himself quite simply in his memoirs. On September 25, the British and French attacks in Artois and Champagne began. Sir John French fell on at Loos with his 15 divisions and with severe losses stormed forward a mile and a half on a front of 7.5. The French attack in Champagne, backed by 34 divisions, made great progress. 17 French divisions committed to the assault drove the remnants of 2 German divisions back 2.5 miles on a front of about 15. Both British and French offensives had been prepared by a gunfire the like of which human beings had never previously delivered or sustained. But once the troops sought to advance beyond the areas pulverized by their batteries, the machine gun and the rifle asserted their then invincible power. General Joffre had evidently been impressed by the reports of the German breakthrough of Gorlicetano. The concentration of French infantry and artillery upon the front of attack was prodigious, and at the outset in the locality it was decisive. But the Germans were not the Russians. There was in fact not the slightest comparison between them. The great French mass, instead of erupting through the pierced German line and fighting back its wounded flanks on either side, found itself confronted with numberless obstinate resistances. On the 26th and 27th it came to a standstill. From that moment its very strength became its weakness. Its mass presented a hideous target to the swiftly gathering German guns. The crater fields which its own artillery had prepared became the tomb of tens of thousands of Frenchmen. The 10th German Corps, which had luckily been snatched from Hindenburg without 1 day's delay, arrived on the scene at the critical moment. The German line, though dinted, was consolidated, and the French, crowded together and unable to deploy, were shot to pieces. The battle in Champagne was one of the most marked examples of the fallacious valuations of General Joffre and his headquarters staff. Even Loos, with all its confusion and waste of young troops, was a less blameworthy defeat. By the early days of October both the French and British attacks had been definitely broken. They were only continued, unconsciously no doubt, to save the faces of the High Command, and to allow the impression of defeat to evaporate in scrambling operations which the world could not follow. Nearly 300,000 French and British soldiers had been killed or wounded. The German front was everywhere intact, and not one single division did Falkenhayn remove from the mass he was gathering against Serbia. On the contrary, at the height of the battle he even diverted the German Alpine Corps to replace the Austrian divisions who had failed to present themselves upon the Danube. We must consider this triple exercise of willpower, the stripping of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the withstanding in the west, and the perfection of the preparations upon the Danube, all simultaneously proceeding, as the culmination of Falkenhayn's command. All was now ready for Serbia. In the spring and throughout the summer the German staff officers had been intently studying the passages of the Danube and the Save. This work, entrusted to the peripatetic Colonel Hensch, had been thoroughly done. Every battery position, every road, every bivouac, every billet, every water spring, all the islands, all the hills, All the railway possibilities had been examined with meticulous energy and the results woven into a complete texture of staff knowledge. 4 armies were now about to spring from 3 sides upon that small and fierce people on whom the guilt of Sarajevo had been fastened. 1 German and 1 Austro-German army was marching towards the Danube, Belgrade and the Save. The 1st Bulgarian army ranged itself to strike towards the historic capital Niš. The 2nd Bulgarian army prepared to lap round to the southwards and, by severing the railway from Salonika, isolate the doomed community from the world and from all forms of succor. The communiques from the Eastern Front still depicted Mackensen fighting with his army group in Poland. Actually, he had been for 3 weeks marshalling 3 of the 4 armies which were about to invade Serbia. One of these mornings, I see from the records of the British War Council, I drew the attention of my colleagues to a sentence amid scores of intelligence reports. Mackensen is in Temesvar. It seemed to me, watching with attention from a situation of knowledge, but without executive authority, that the Bulgarian menace, which was now so open, must be a part of a general design against Serbia, and to clear a road for Germany to sustain the Turkish armies at the Dardanelles. Realization came a few days later. On September 20, our military attaché with the Serbians mentioned that there was more than the usual movement of troops and trains beyond the rivers, and on the 23rd he reported a steady increase in the German and Austrian forces beyond the Serbian frontier. On the same day the Bulgarian mobilization was announced. Still no one could tell how much Germany intended to do. Pressure and threats from the north by Austrian and German forces might be a sufficient assistance to a purely Bulgarian attack upon Serbia. Worrying always about the Dardanelles, I naturally credited the Germans with similar preoccupations. The words "Mackensen is at Temesvar" seemed to glare from the pages and pages of stuff we had to read each day. All doubts were soon to be removed. Mackensen's preparations were approaching completion. The most capable commanders were placed at his disposal. Gallwitz commanded the German 11th, and Kövess the Austro-German 3rd Army. It will be remembered that the earlier Austrian invasions of Serbia had been launched mainly from Bosnia across the western frontier. The Austrians had considered the forcing of the Danube, often more than 1,000 yards broad, too serious an operation. Podgorek had tried what he thought was an easier way. His experience had led him to remark to his successor at the moment of dismissal, "If you ever have the chance again, go in by Belgrade." The Germans were of this opinion too. In the early days of October they marched the 3rd and 11th Armies rapidly southward from the areas where they had been concealed to the selected passages of the Danube and the Save on either side of Belgrade. Few indeed are the instances in history of a river line athwart the advance of a superior army proving an effective defense. Mystifying bombardments at many points and an elaborate feint at Orsova baffled the Serbians. Almost to the last they remained in doubt of the actual points of passage, and altogether unwitting of the enormous forces which were rolling upon them. 2 of their 3 small armies, the 1st and 3rd, at length faced the Austro-Germans, and their remaining 2nd Army stood between Niš and the rapidly assembling Bulgarian 1st Army. Against the Bulgarian 2nd Army, which to the southward threatened their sole railway line for reinforcements or retreat, they could muster only detachments and volunteers. On the 7th of October both Teutonic armies began the passage of the rivers. Assisted by large islands, by the overpowering artillery which had opened on the 6th, and by the Austrian monitors, they soon established themselves after heavy fighting and several local repulses on the southern bank. On the 8th they were ferried across in great numbers. Belgrade fell to the Austrians on the 9th, and very large forces were dug in on Serbian soil along a 50-mile front on both sides of the city. The Serbians had placed their oldest men in the trenches and fortified positions from which the crossings were resisted. They now counterattacked fiercely with both their northern armies. Hard fighting followed, but the weight and power of the Germans across the river grew continually. Mackensen had ordered the advance to begin on the 15th, but Gallwitz, visiting him personally, explained that his horses were not yet across. The general attack was therefore postponed till the 18th. On this day the battle began along the whole front. All day the Serbians held their positions, but on the 19th they were overwhelmed at many points. And by the 24th both the Teutonic armies were advancing steadily into the center of Serbia. It is surprising both that the two bridges across the Danube were not completed till the 21st, and that the invasion could be supplied in the interval entirely by boats. Mackensen had hoped that the Serbians would stand and be surrounded at their arsenal and military center of Kragujevac. But this temptation they resisted. Burning and blowing up their stores and depots, they continued their retreat to the southward. They had need to do so. On the 23rd the Bulgarian First Army crashed upon them from the east, and a savage battle between armies whose soldiers hated each other with personal loathing and the memory of recent bitter wrongs began. Slowly but surely the fresher and far more numerous Bulgarians prevailed, and the Serbian Second Army retired towards their old capital. Meanwhile the Bulgarian Second Army, driving a weak opposition before it, had already captured Veles and Kumanovo by the 23rd, thus cutting the vital railway line behind the forlorn people. These tragic events, as they swiftly developed, produced emotion in the British cabinet. Ever since the end of September, there had been an intense desire among many of its leading members to save Serbia. Greece was by treaty bound to come to the assistance of her neighbor against a Bulgarian attack. But Greece, torn between the diverging sympathies of King Constantine and the Prime Minister Venizelos, had no mind to plunge into the storm. The Greco-Serbian agreement had stipulated that the Serbians should assign 150,000 men to defend their southern province, and as these were all engaged against the Germans in the north, it was easy to declare that the casus foederis had not arisen. The British and French cabinets, animating each other, now saw the means of breaking off the attack upon Gallipoli and using the troops landed at Suvla Bay to stimulate Greek resolution and rescue the Serbs. At the end of September, one French and one British division were shipped from the peninsula. After tangled negotiations, they were landed at Salonika on October 5, upon the withdrawn invitation of Venizelos and the forthcoming protest of King Constantine. General Serrai arrived from France to take command in this new theatre. From the moment the Serbian government had realized the extent of their danger, Monsieur Pašić had been ceaseless in his cries for help. The Western Allies must send him 150,000 men, or all was certainly lost. At the very least, he urged that the Allies should clear the railway line and secure the escape of the Serbian army. The politicians, then in the ascendant in London, were eager to comply. But the general staffs of Britain and France proved decisively that such an operation was not physically possible. The rolling stock and capacity of the Salonika railway could not carry an army of such numbers and its supplies into Serbia within 6 or 7 weeks. A single French regiment was for a moment to be sent to Niš, and the streets were pathetically decorated to welcome them. Less sentimental counsels soon prevailed, and the Western Allies declared they could only move northwards when they had concentrated an adequate force. The Bulgarians, who had cut the railway at Veles, caused the precipitate retreat of a French detachment which had ventured across the Greek frontier. At first, during these painful days, the general staffs had assured their governments that the real relief for Serbia would come from the great offensives of Artois and Champagne. They could not believe that in the face of such a threat, still less during the actual battle, the Germans could find any serious force to attack Serbia. Once the conflict was joined in the west, they were sure everything else would fade into insignificance. When this hope proved visionary, the only course which was considered was the breaking off of all offensive operations at Gallipoli in order to reinforce Salonika. Whatever this policy might or might not achieve, it obviously could bring no aid to Serbia in time. The only chance of preventing the Bulgarians from declaring war was the use of the British fleet and French squadron to force the Dardanelles. The defenses of the straits had not only not been replenished with heavy shells and ammunition, but a large proportion of their mobile armaments had been drawn into the fighting on the Gallipoli Peninsula. At any time during September, a resolute attack on the forts and the sweeping or breaking of the minefields offered good prospects of success. The entry of the fleet into the Marmara would have destroyed the communications of the Turkish army in Gallipoli and would almost inevitably have entailed their surrender. Failure would have meant heavy losses in the old and obsolete ships of which the fleet was solely composed, as well as the deaths of several thousand sailors. In spite of the vehement appeals of Admiral Keyes, chief of the naval staff at the Dardanelles, who actually resigned his position and proceeded to London to plead his cause, the Admiralty would not face the responsibility of ordering the attempt. I marveled much in those sad days at the standard of values and sense of proportion which prevailed among our politicians and naval and military authorities. The generals were so confident of breaking the line in France that they gathered masses of cavalry behind the assaulting troops to ride through the huge gaps they expected to open on the hostile front. To sacrifice 250,000 men in such an affair seemed to them the highest military wisdom. That was the orthodox doctrine of war. Even if it did not succeed, no error or breach of the rules would have been committed. But to lose 1/100th part as many sailors and a dozen old ships, all of which were in any case to be put on the mother bank in a few months' time, with the possibility of gaining an inestimable prize, there was a risk before which the boldest uniformed greyhead stood appalled. The Admiralty and generals had their way. The fleet continued idle at the Dardanelles. The armies shattered themselves against the German defense in France. The Bulgarians carried an army of 300,000 men to join our enemies, and Serbia as a factor in the war was obliterated. I found it unendurable to remain participant in such crimes against truth and reason. No hope remained to the Serbian army and government but escape. Niš fell on November 5. The left of the Bulgarian Second Army was now advancing northward from Veles along the railway. At the other extreme, an Austrian division invading from Bosnia had approached Visegrad. The three armies of Mackensen, now in one line, drove all before them. The Serbian forces pressed together, retreated to the south and west, carrying with them Prince Alexander, now become regent, the civil government, the prostrate Voivode Putnik in a litter, a multitude of women and children, and the 24,000 Austrian prisoners, hostages perhaps, they had captured from Podgoric in 1914. By the middle of November they had reached Kosovo Polje, the field of the blackbirds, where the earlier agony of their race had been endured. Although the valiant defense of the defile of Kašanik by two Serbian divisions had prevented the Second Bulgarian Army from making a complete encirclement, all chance of cutting a way out of the south was gone. The sole resource was flight in the depth of winter across the mountain tracks of Albania to the Adriatic and to the fleets of the Allies. At Pristina, the women and children were left behind, and the remnants of the army, and, as it seemed, of the nation, ragged, exhausted, almost starving, with their last cartridges, plunged into the savage Albanian defiles, where dwelt a race their equal in fierceness and hunger. The Germans and Austrians disdained to follow these remnants farther, but the Bulgarians spurred a racial vengeance, pursued the melting columns like ferocious wolves. After harsh privations and the deaths of thousands from famine and exposure, 150,000 men, half of whom still preserved their military formation, arrived on the sea-coast at the port of San Giovanni de Medua. They were still in possession of 100 guns and of their 24,000 prisoners. Out of 425,000 men comprising the entire manhood of the country, born on the rationed strength of the Serbian army at the beginning of October, over 100,000 had been killed or wounded. 160,000 more, together with 900 guns, had been captured by the enemy. The survivors had still a hard pilgrimage before they found sanctuary. San Giovanni de Medua was too near to the Austrian fleet at Pola to serve as a port of embarkation. During the whole of December the Serbians were toiling down the Adriatic coast painfully, and ultimately the survivors were transported to the island of Corfu. To celebrate these triumphs, King Ferdinand entered the Kaiser at a banquet in Niš. It was January 18, the 215th anniversary of the coronation of Frederick I as King of Prussia and of the institution of the Order of the Black Eagle. It was the 45th anniversary of the foundation of the German Empire. The guest, the scene, and the occasion stirred the romanticism by which King Ferdinand was so often moved. Twice, in the hopes of aggrandizement, had he staked the Bulgarian crown and people. Now, sure that victory had been won, he pronounced in the language, pomp, and ruthless spirit of the Roman age the following invocation: Hail, Emperor, Caesar, and King! Thou art victor and glorious. In ancient Niš all the peoples of the East salute thee, the Redeemer, bringing the oppressed prosperity and salvation. But the scroll of fate was only half unfolded. 125,000 ragged, war-bitten men, the survivors of an army driven from their native land, homeless men whose families were in the power of their most hated foes, were gathered upon the island of Corfu. There, aided by England and France, they will reform the Serbian army, and upon their bayonets, while Ferdinand sits a dethroned exile, and Bulgaria is forever barred from greatness, the general victory of the Allies will found, with a population of nearly 20 million souls, the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes.